Greetings, beauties of beloved Earth. So the continuation of Albert Coe's incredible book of his encounter with Threat, the Venusian, that he rescued in the 1920s. So the book can be a little bit convoluted. Its, narration can be a little confusing for me. So I hope that it translates, because there is a lot of grammatical errors throughout the book. I mean, obviously back in those days, they didn't have things like Word like we do now. So anyway, enjoy. It's a continuation from chapter 4, and this moves into chapter 5, explaining actually the different religious concepts that the Venusians have witnessed over thousands of years that have captured the hearts, minds, and souls of man of Earth. Enjoy. So that I do not leave your brain in an utter state of confusion regarding the tremendous time spans in a galactic cycle that I have compared to 24 hours of Earth, let us imagine a galactic clock, fashioned in exact conformity to one of Earth, with identical numerals from 1 to 12 around its face, but for each sweep of the second hand around the dial of an Earth clock that denotes 1 minute would comparatively tick off 155,000 years on the galactic clock. To establish a medium of parallel, we will assume that an Earth day starts at 12 o'clock high noon, when a specific zone on its curvature reaches an apex in relation to the Sun, a fixed point, and of course Earth's rotation tends to create a descending arc on this spot, instituting your PM until midnight and the ascending arc of AM to the point of beginning, completing a day. Now apply this same reference of high noon, etc., to our solar system as its position in the galaxy reaches this same relationship to the universal nucleus, a similar fixed point to start its new day. It is rather difficult to transpose our mathematics and calculus into spoken English, for several factors upset this apparent orderly progression. And just as Earth tables of continuance vary and require adjustment over long stretches of time, there are fluctuations in galactic spin and orbital velocity, as it often weaves a zigzag course due to pulsation of nucleus energy flux that wraps the magnetic line of force, in which it travels, and also, in a true sense of the word, galaxies are not rigid entities, but, as a topic of evaluation, these figures and this principle will hold fairly accurate. However, we do base our tables of elapsed rotational times from these mathematically fixed entities, but as the solar system in the galaxy approaches and passes this assumed point of high noon, the nucleus influence again pulls up the mountains, and the major glaciation periods, or, as commonly known, great ice ages, ensue on its planets, and this point, having been passed just over 1 million years ago, will bring our clocks into proportionate time perspective of 12.07 in a new galactic day. And in looking back, if we apply this same time value of our imaginary clock, we will see the elemental Homo sapien emerge from the primate genus at 10:20 o'clock, and the last of the prolific dinosaurs give up the ghost at 6 o'clock to an intolerable temperature and climactic change of budding mountains and a minor glaciation period, as the solar system comes out from behind the bulk of the galaxy, between it and the nucleus, just as your position on Earth comes out from behind the bulk of the planet relative to the Sun at dawn. I realize that I have thrown many curves at you today, and do hope that you can grasp these fundamentals of physics, for it is an insight to the formulas on which our philosophies are based, and the varied and random appearance of all things that are created through the restless motion of universal force is the underlying reason for these beliefs. We do not delude ourselves with any thought of permanence or extensions after death, as this transmigration of energy is momentarily fixed in the manifestation of matter, for even a billion years that may appear as an eternity to the human is a mere infinitesimal pause in this everlasting flight. With this truth in mind, we redouble our efforts to extend our limited span of being, and to it endow all the wisdom, beauty, love, and compassion that only a human brain may extol. And now, my friend, we have talked ourselves into the setting sun. So the time has arrived when we must terminate this delightful day, pack our gear, and head for home, but can continue this discussion as we drive back. While taking our rods apart, I mentioned that he had not used the little gem that I retrieved from the brambles at our first meeting, and he replied, "Nor am I wearing the flying suit, for those items belong to the other side of my life, and like our identities cannot, at present, become part of your world. Also, in another truth, I would not take an unfair advantage in our fishing contest, and by the way, that hot cup of coffee is going to taste doubly good, for the larger fish is in my catch, so you stand the treat." It seemed incomprehensible that anyone of such a great age could act as boyish as he, displayed the enthusiasm in little things that most youngsters only enjoy. But his amazing trait was the unlimited source of knowledge, the easy manner in which he found expression, and a simple explanation of what I knew must be deeply involved mathematical problems, so that I may form a reasonable opinion of the strange and unfamiliar facets of our world. By the way, mathematics did come easy to me and my dad, and Dad had given some pre-college tutoring in the complexities of engineering and architecture. But even as Rhett's voice softened, as though with a tinge of regret, in undermining the faith of ideals that I had believed in throughout my short lifetime, but in a directness that left no room for parry, no defense against his logic, and I had a very strong hunch that he could also prove his assertions. I doubt if I will ever forget that metal disc with him inside as it slowly ascended a few feet above ground, and then in the twinkling of an eye, with only a flash of silver from a sun glint, it vanished. I realized it could not have evaporated, and that he was not an apparition, for his hand clasp was firm and warm. But a truth was slowly becoming apparent, that our educators had only a hazy inkling into this vast and mysterious universe. No concrete knowledge to envision highly intelligent people dwelling on other stars instead of angles, or the slightest conception of the inconceivable ships they used to traverse these tremendous distances. It was an awe-inspiring thought to only conjecture that I may be permitted a tiny peephole to view some of its marvels. My feelings were actually difficult to determine, as they range from walking on air to an uncertain puzzles, and boy, just a bit afraid of where it may all lead, but did have a great trust in my stranger, perhaps in the guise of hero worship, and in his attitude towards me, could only find a correlation in the gentleness of a mother's love as she guides her baby through childhood. Fascination, apprehension, fantasy, belief and doubt tumbled around in my head, mountains springing up and wearing down, ice, imaginative galactic clocks, turtles, horseshoe crabs, crocodiles, and sea serpents, like beads of an infinite string stretching into hundreds of millions of years. Energy, gases, objects, gases. My thoughts were interrupted by Zret's voice. "Quite silent, aren't you? Are you deeply puzzled?" Overpowered, I replied. "Would fit better. And you know, every time I see one of those doggone turtles pop off a log, I will picture a dim primeval swamp with all kinds of ooze and gases rising from its surface." Zret really laughed and said, "So many of your impressions and perceptions have an unexpected uniqueness, all of their own, and their unruffled composure, a knack of taking everything in stride, even to the first moment of our meeting, puzzled me at times, probably as much as I do you, but I am very sure that our comradeship will long endure in a most enjoyable vein. For your mind is sharp, and what is more refreshing, it is an open mind. And now, with the same reluctance that you feel in terminating this day, we must leave and be on our way." We had been riding for several minutes, both lost in thought, when he reopened the conversation with an analysis of his views on our philosophies, by again retracing sequels through the corridors of time. As each incident fitted into its interlacing pattern, it seemed as though an intricate tapestry was being woven in pictures of unfolding history, and the flow of his words carried me back to relive, step by step, every thought, fear, and inspiration, as a struggling brain sought an answer in this baffling but eternal quest of why. The glimmerings of present religious beliefs or philosophies on your planet stretch into its dim unrecorded mists of 10,000 years, but did not become an obsession of the mind until about 8,800 years ago, when an awakening racial remnant that had survived the self-induced cataclysm of world upheaval 4,000 years before initiated the dawning of what is known as the early Eastern cultures, as they partially revived the withered root of a former scientific knowledge. But its fragmentary principles were nurtured on greed, fear, and a lack of complete understanding that eventually developed the mental hybrid which has given life to the millions of gods, totems, images, and charms that bridge these hundreds of centuries. The myriad of groupings of men who have marched through these pages of time, each contributed an imaginative piece to fit into this mysterious puzzle of creation, and the personification of energy as Godhead, to which he endowed his own exclusive emotion of love, and its opposite, severity, was an attempt to control his environment through a cajoling or an appeasement of these fearful and incomprehensible forces of nature in the supplication of prayer or ritual of sacrifice. Calamity, represented in earthquake, volcanic eruptions, meteorites, thunder and lightning, flood and assorted disaster, an attribute to the wrath of a specifically designated God, through a participation in sin and adversity, prompting these sins against God, laid to influence of an evil spirit or demon that only the purification of religious reverence could erase. From these basic spirals, the embellishment as each creed, tribe, or race created its own quote-unquote true God, or complex of true gods, in an ever-expanding divergency of thought And although they all worship the same true essence in the deity, selfishness led to the narrow-minded chaos of intolerance and brutality, as each sect had fought to defend or impose on others its own conception of this divinity. Christian doctrine combines several branchings from these earlier Eastern cosmologies, notably Magi, Egyptian, Babylonian, and Hebrew, in a semi-consolidation with findings of later Greek philosophers in their diligent search for the primal stuff from which everything is made. Magi instituted the celestial paradise and transmigration of a good soul to its benefit of eternal life, and the bad soul's condemnation to the tortures of fiery demons. The Egyptians dramatized in metaphysical sacredness the transformation of one substance into another, seed into plant, the consuming of plant or animal by man, became man, malt and water, changed to beer, dung materialized into beetles, chiseled and shaped stones into gods, etc. The body's loss of animation also released its soul, that started a hazardous journey to the judgment hall. After surviving many trials, tribulations, and purgatory, it faced a panel of questioning judges, and the merit of this confession determined its fate. If true, the soul was presented to its God for his blessing and entered the land of everlasting plenty. But a falsified confession condemned it to transformation into a black pig or the horrors of a devouring demon, according to the severity of infraction. Babylon donated the base belief of an orderly pattern in creation. Their exhaustive study in the movement of heavenly bodies revealed a regulated appearance of planets, stars, and constellations that apparently controlled all the elements, so essential to the livelihood of plant, animal, and man. Characteristic, seasonal change, rainfall, drought, etc. Also the base of modern astrology. The Hebrew contributed God the Father and segments of its Torah. The Greek philosopher sought his answers in abstractions rather than a true conformity to religious motivation, and I will confine this analysis in a 200-year span, roughly from 600 BC, as theory, and debate finally resolved into an acceptable conclusion of Aristotle's logic. During this period, many philosophers wrangled over the problem of a prime factor or factors, and with the exception of one wedge of truth that was inserted, but discarded, we'll concentrate on the few that directly influenced the deductions of comparison that established the Aristotelian theory. As we enter this maze of mathematics and theoretical will-o'-the-wisps, we first encounter Pythagoras, scholar and mathematician, as he bends his efforts to confirm a belief that numbers are the ultimate elements of the universe, and that his isolation of a quintessence, which he termed aether, his supposed substance from which the heavenly bodies were composed. Substance also represented the soul of man and death, the transmigration of this soul to its seat of origin. As we move deeper into this maze of bedlam of voices, reco, into argument and debate, one element, two elements, fire, three elements, air and water are bandied back and forth until the voice of Empedocles rings out loud and clear, expounding this theory that all things are made from a mixture of four basic elements: fire, water, air, and earth. Proportionate fractions of each in the mix to determine whether bug, mouse, king, plant, or mountain materialized. Our path widens considerably with the appearance of Leucippus and his pupil Democritus, as they also questioned what is matter. And, in a completely new line of thinking, is it continuous? They try to imagine chopping away at an object without ever reaching the final piece that could not be divided, and as this posed an illogical mathematical equation, they concluded that matter must be discontinuous, and that when the ultimate atomon, indivisible particle, was reached, it would vanish under the last chop. The further studies of Democritus convinced him that these invisible atomons, of varying shape and characteristic, were in a state of constant motion, and the characteristic of each would either attract or repel one another, but from those that did mate were born the tiny building blocks that evolved into all solids of matter. He did not have method or instrumentation to prove this theory, and being so contradictory to all the religious presumptions of an orderly creation by its gods, was subsequently denounced by them, under premise that if this hypothesis were true, the random attractions or repulsions of these atoms, as they flitted haphazardly about, could only create a disorganized universe without a vestige of moral purpose. So the path narrows again into its unfathomable maze and the powerful brain of Aristotle, in creating his enduring shrine to the four elements, abetted by favor of the Church, slammed shut the door on further research for well over 1,000 years. As we glance around this colossal temple of the mind, our eyes fasten on its central pedestal, the irrefutable strength of syllogism, encircling this symbol of deductive reasoning stand its supporting pillars of common sense and the reflex to truth. That observation in everyday trends of life appear to sustain. It is a great pity that the brilliance of Aristotle's acquisitive brain did not evaluate the intangibles in the theory of Democritus, rather than combine the tangibles of Empedocles with the distorted intangible of Pythagoras, and although it may be wishful thinking, may have advanced the philosophies in comprehensive doctrine 2,000 years beyond their present station. For the tenets resulting from this system of common sense were anchored on such solid ground that only the improving instrumentation of modern science has been able to shake one foundation stone of this massive structure. Its keystone of syllogistic logic may be illustrated by advancing relative statements that call for an answer to the specifics or original premise. For example, an initial assertion declares that all mammals are warm-blooded, then adds horses are mammals, which can only summarize in a common-sense conclusion that horses are warm-blooded. In this line of reasoning, Aristotle's visual appraisal of the world seemed to bear out that its common composition did embody a varied mixing of rudimental elements, as envisioned by Empedocles, but he deduced that specific properties were missing, and to allow for tolerance of the myriad types in manifestation, added 4 qualities to each element. To the element fire were added extreme heat and dryness, to air, lesser warmth and moisture, water, cold and wet, earth, cold and dry, thereby establishing a hypothesis that substance represents the various amounts of the 4 elements in the mixture, and proportionate mixing of the 4 qualities produce characteristic formation of every objective solid or conceivable intangible of the universe. To the mixture in creation of a human, Aristotle concluded with an addition of the quintessence, aether, the purest of the pure, as isolated by Pythagoras, which not only confirmed man's noble station, just below the angels, but above and with complete domination over all lesser entities. This persistent surmise of being molded from a very special clay has given rise to a greatly inflated ego, as man of earth assumed that he, this noblest of all the mortals, could only dwell on an equally exalted mortal station, as core or center of the universe, around which every other motivation revolved. In compressing the vast reaches of the universe, its great God of creative energy and his infinite billions of suns and galaxies into this equative ratio of a minute stationary piece of real estate, in family community, he also compressed his mind in proportionate guise of community activity. Emperor ruled the empire, the general of his army, a husband his household, and even the child its toy. So in this compact principle of pattern was formulated the dogma to personalize a private God, to guide or rule in overall jurisdiction. Zret continued, in concluding this brief analysis of basic segments that underline the myriad cults and their assortment of representative gods, only in the teachings of Christ can we determine an essence of the true universal God. A far-reaching vision that did not bestow exclusive favoritism on the entity of man, but also covered the lamb that man so thoughtlessly subjected to the horror of fire and a senseless ritual of sacrifice, or in the beauty of a blade of grass that was trodden underfoot. In expounding these compassionate tenets, he made attempt to instill a realization that all things are the children of an expansive God, that the virtue of compassion alone could abolish man's inhumanity to man, his acts of brutality, and only man himself, through a love of man, could establish a true state of salvation, as he, Christ, gave up his mortal life to imprint this truth on the mind of humanity forever. But we are afraid that as a Christian doctrine, backed by the power of Rome, embarked on its composite of preceding cosmologies, Jesus, his comprehension of understanding, the great depth of wisdom in his teachings, were lost to the diffusion of selfishness as man, once again, sought to possess a private God for his own specific little sphere, with the sword or torture rack to all non-believers, surely as foreign to Christ as he was to the bits of wood and stone that had been carved in a version of God before his coming. And now I have probably talked away past your supper time, which will be corrected in that restaurant just ahead. Zret and I were seated in a cozy little booth with a lighted candle in the center of the table that had accumulated a tremendous buildup of wax droppings, and the soft glow of its flickering flame created an atmosphere of warmth and friendship that seemed so fitting as this wonderful day was drawing to its close. During supper, Zret remarked, "I have taken several hours to answer just 4 of your questions, and in a rather schematic pattern at that, but it should give you a fair impression as to the thoroughness in which I intend to teach, and although you may not fully comprehend or remember all that I have said today, if you are still deeply interested in my promise of a complete knowledge, the future hours that we spend together I shall number among the more enjoyable of my life. I do not believe I will ever feel closer to my stranger than at this moment, and I told Zret I doubted if I could forget even one word that he had spoken today, for archaeology and paleontology were fascinating subjects to me, and had studied many of my dad's architectural books, which carried one back to early Egypt, its pyramids, temples and mummies, to classic Greek, and Rome, was familiar with the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle. I enjoyed reading Homer, and in the past have spent many hours in the museums of art and natural history in New York. For my quest of knowledge seems unquenchable, and from our discussion today, I feel sure that you can fill in the missing links and gaps of our recorded history. It will be with the greatest eagerness that I look forward to seeing you again, Zred, and hope that the intervals will not be too long in between. But before leaving me off at home tonight, there is one question that I wish you would answer. My brother is studying aviation, and I have pumped him regarding various types of airplanes, and from his answers, the only principle in existence that could lift a heavier than a vehicle in takeoff is an engine and propeller, except under certain conditions, the air currents that sustain a slow and unpredictable glider, and it requires quite a wingspan. Ever since you took off in that little round disc of yours, I have been trying to figure how it works, and the only thing that comes to mind is a rifle in principle. You can see the bullet when inserted into the magazine, but once you pull the trigger, it disappears through a tremendous velocity in leaving the nozzle, just as you disappeared in a split second. And I know that you did not evaporate, for I watched your ship move very, very slowly across the river the night that you paused overhead. Oh, and also another thing. How do you take up? I guess it would be called the recoil. For all guns kick, and even a sudden start of an automobile presses one back against to the seat, or in a quick stop you may go through the windshield. To keep me from going nutty trying to fathom out these mysteries, what really makes your little ship fly? How do you anchor yourself inside? Will you ever take me for a ride? Zret studied me for at least a full minute, and he replied, "You know very well where your question leads, and even if there was time this evening to answer them, I am not at liberty to disclose the many mathematical details involved in the operation of our ships, but can ease your mind with a few examples of action and reaction resulting from natural force. The planet on which we are sitting, Earth, in its flight around the Sun, travels more than 500 million miles at high velocity in 1 year. But does it have an engine and a propeller? Let's see, how do I anchor myself in? This one has a bit of a quizzical twist, but does show some deep thinking on your part, and you probably also formed a mental picture of me being splattered all over the inside of my ship, and rather than quote the slightly dull routine of figures, I will illustrate with an amusing but wholly understandable representation. Suppose that you took a juicy apple pie and without removing it from the cardboard plate, scaled it into the air. What would happen? Just as you visualized should happen to me in motivation of your query. The plate would sail in one direction, the crust scatter about, and the juicy apples inside splatter over everything. Because each component is traveling at a disconnected and separate entity, reacting in their own very specific way to force and velocity. The same reactive principle that affects a person riding in an automobile, plane, etc. So in another supposition, a similar fragile pie is frozen solid in its plate and scaled. It will glide a bit before hitting the ground, bounce or roll, and come into rest intact, for each of its components has been moving as a whole, and although we are not frozen in our ships, this same state of synchronized unity is achieved through a method of fusing ship and crew as an integral mass, for if they traveled as a separate entity, the extreme velocities that we may employ in takeoff, or the slightest angle of deviation, or complete turn from a straight line in flight, would pulverize any human against his seat or on the walls of the ship. I realize this is not a very scientific explanation, but the principles involved are at least contemporary and should keep you from going nutty. Under certain rulings imposed, in coming to your planet, we Venusians are not permitted to allow anyone, except of our own race, to even enter the ships, for a negative condition could possibly arise. So a quote-unquote ride will have to await some future day, if or when this ruling should ever be revised. And now, young man, it is after 9 o'clock, and your mother, as my adopted one, are probably starting to worry about us. So finish your coffee, for this delightful day must inevitably come to a close, and that time has just about arrived. Thus was my formal, or shall I correctly say, my informal introduction to an inconceivable race of people from Venus, and the wealth of knowledge endowed to me by this one of its members called Zret. The seemingly unbelievable facts that he has revealed, I cannot doubt, for so many of the topics in his teachings are now being confirmed by our own research. In all my lifetimes, I will never be as impressed with any invention as my first glimpse of that little round disc standing on its 3 legs in the clearing of the wilderness 46 years ago. The impression in my mind, as vivid today as the moment I stood in the open-mouthed wonder and watched it whisk away to become enveloped in the blue of the sky.